Well, thanks, Michael. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the CMDB best practices when you want to extend or customize your CMDB. And I know a lot of our customers do have to do some level of customization. And I wanted to pick your brain and get some of your 2 cents on what customers should look out for, what they should do, where should they start in this journey. I know it's a bit of a black art. It comes with a certain like trepidation for most people, and I think they're looking for the wisdom of what we can provide them here.
Yeah, Mark, it's interesting because over the years in doing implementations, going all the way back to Aspen, what I would consider inbounds for customization now is really very different from what I might have thought about back then. As you're aware, we spent a lot of time expanding the model structure within the CMDB in and of itself to account for use cases that were largely outside of ServiceNow's main domain focus areas, which was service management, obviously, back in the early years, and really brought it to a level where it really needs to be a very special use case to think about customization these days. And as you know, we're driving a much more prescriptive set of outcomes and business rules surrounding those outcomes than we ever have before. And so I second the notion that it is a black art, and I really highly caution customers about doing so. One of the most important things is to really understand how the CMDB model structure works in and of itself. And it's an inheritance model, really, that descends from CI, CMDB_CI. And so even when you're thinking about customizing something for a very specific business purpose, you want to be aware of the level where you introduce that customization at. And so I encourage people to really understand that inheritance model and where specific types of technologies enter into that inheritance model. For example, virtualization actually begins to appear above the hardware layer. So you want to be very specific about what you're targeting for either a custom table insertion or a custom set of attributes to support a business outcome, but really make sure that you're targeting it for the right level within that inheritance model.
Yeah. So it's very object oriented, and you have a base class, if you will, and then you inherit those properties and attributes and whatnot, and you specialize for various things as you continue to further refine the model, the class hierarchy. Okay.
Yep. And so awareness of what you're thinking about and where it falls in that object structure is really important.
Okay. Now, do you see most of the stuff that we're getting into in the future, especially I know we're going into new market areas such as, operational technologies and things like that. Is your suggestion as customers find something that just doesn't fit the mold at all for the types that they can find, would you recommend they create a new sort of class at the base level, or try to fit it, like if it seems like it's hardware, kind of stick it under hardware and create a new type of hardware, for example?
Yeah, I highly recommend that people not create things at the base level, because, for example, if they're creating a custom attribute and they create it at the base level, every class that inherits from the base level inherits that attribute, and it creates a tremendous amount of overhead, not only from a maintenance perspective, but in the way that things actually need to be traversed when you go to query them. So I obviously would not recommend that. It needs to be very targeted. If you choose to do something, or you need to do something to support a business outcome, needs to be really targeted, and you need to know where in the model structure that targeting needs to take place.
Yeah. So really study the model and get down to as finite level in the class hierarchy that you can, and then start from there.
Yep. Models are updated via the store now.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first thing I would suggest is if you think you need a new class structure and you can't find it out of the box, that I would look at the store and see if there have been model structures that have been updated via the store that maybe you don't have in your family related instance yet. That I would suggest starting there. And then I would also reach out, via the community as well, because technology being what it is can be pretty complicated, and sometimes things don't readily appear exactly where you think they would, and for a good reason. But it's always good to double check before you go wandering off on your own.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. On the store release of the CIs and the CMDB's models, why are we going through the store route versus just do it every 6 months with the family release?
It's so we can be way more agile about it.
Yeah.
As you noted, earlier, we're expanding in outside of what I would call IT in and of itself, more into core technology areas, and we're doing so in support of our vertical products and our presence in areas in technology where we didn't have a large footprint for. It's so we can be way more agile about it. For example, we're updating models in the telecom space pretty regularly now. We're doing updates to the IoT space regularly now. And also akin to that is in our support of the service graph connectors in and of themselves. We're partnering with companies, or we're developing integrations for companies now that have a much larger footprint, that are touching things that are not necessarily considered core IT, but maybe OT or IoT. And in order to bring that data in correctly, obviously there needs to be model support there from a class structure perspective.
Yeah, and I've gotten a lot of questions from customers and about certain technology stacks, right? If I bring in Kubernetes, what will that look like? And it's not always clear where stuff is going to land in the CMDB based on using a certain service graph connector, or not understanding what discovery pattern is going to create in terms of the model. Any suggestions on being able to dig into that? I've seen some documentation, but I don't know. Do you have any advice for our customers on that?
Well, so if you're talking about K8 specifically, obviously there are discovery patterns that are supporting that. And with those types of technologies that tend to be more ephemeral, it's even more important to really understand what you're doing, because you don't want to get into a situation, particularly where you're auto scaling to support load in your K8s. You want to make sure that those things get cleaned up as they're spun down. So you just don't want a representation of a point in time. You want a representation of what's happening as events, quotation marks, are occurring. And so it's really important to understand what the pattern looks like, first of all, and how you're going to deal with life cycle inside of that pattern.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue a little bit on the life cycle, because the life cycle for some things is long, and now with these dynamic environments, cloud, it's very ephemeral. Any advice on how to deal with that, or should customers try to have an exact representation up to the second in their CMDB, or just kind of step away and say, we know this is going to scale in and out, and we won't worry about how many servers, just that there are servers there?
Well, what I would say about that is it depends on what you're trying to gain from the information in and of itself. And so understanding different load factors at time of day that cause scaling to occur, and if there are patterns around that you could go back and look at historically, that might be some important learnings for not only how your application is functioning, but how it's functioning over time, and what are the stressors involved in providing what I would call a good customer experience with that application. So if I'm trying to learn about that, then I would be interested in what it looks like, not necessarily second over second, but over given periods of time, you know, polling at a 5-minute interval, for example, might be sufficient for that type of use case, and understanding what that looks like over points in time. Outside of that, there are some other use cases, particularly in licensing and use of even some open source libraries that have implications depending upon how that auto scaling is functioning, what's involved at any given point in time. So there are other use cases that would support that. I would still say that understanding the base service and the telemetry around that base service from what I would call a monitoring perspective is important. Maybe the ups and downs at any given point in time in terms of the number of pods that you have up and that type of thing, maybe not so important from a governance perspective, but definitely important in terms of understanding your position from a resilient services point of view.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of times I say it's very use case driven. Don't collect the data if you have no use case for it. I see a lot of folks that do have a pattern of just throwing everything in the kitchen sink into their CMDB and not necessarily managing it well. Any advice on that? I know we've done a lot of work on the Data Foundation's dashboards to look at things like that.
Well, what I would say is not all CIs are created equally. And really, the things that you want to focus on, again, are dependent upon the use cases that you're driving. But there are some objects that are way more important than others. So, for example, understanding the logical representation of an application service, its underlying application that's running, you know, your Tomcat, your WebSphere, your JBoss, that kind of stuff, and the database instance that's supporting that, and obviously the infrastructure that those things are on are very, very, very important. They're important from a number of different vectors. Understanding, you know, your exposure from a security risk around the data contained within the database instance structure. Obviously, understanding how well your service is running. And again, from a governance perspective, thinking about software asset management, entitlement, licensure, you know, those kinds of things. So there are a number of different vectors that are important in those areas, but focusing on that triangle and its relationship to the logical service is probably the most important point.
And everything tends to be a detail related to that, which you know, scales down in importance factor.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, obviously, you know, if people are having trouble hitting your web app, there are some things you're going to want to look at, right? Like you might look at the load balancing techniques that are happening just above the app server, for example. You know, how people are getting in and hitting it, your endpoint. But beyond that, being able to trace the route through the application out to the database instance structure that's supporting it and making sure that that's all healthy is obviously a key to providing quality services to your end users. But beyond that, those tend to be where the high dollars are in terms of understanding your spend and how it's supporting your business needs via those application services.
Yeah. And that's interesting. You talked about routes too. And I know we're seeing more and more use cases where customers are tracking devices in their clients or partners' data centers. And almost of the boundaries of the CMDB are becoming much more fuzzy, having to collect information that's part of their digital products and services that they're offering to their customers.
I mean, I think it's a natural progression. I mean,
yeah.
You know, so many enterprises have gone to either some form of extensive middleware or some form of SaaS-oriented API gateway structure, or plain SaaS applications in and of themselves, and they are so dependent on those things that being able to touch those points and understanding whether you are getting the services that you're paying for, whether they're healthy, they're operating in a good way, and providing a good end user experience is becoming more and more important.
Yeah. Yeah. And another thing I've seen a lot of folks worried about understanding the interconnected tissue between all these application services. They're able to spin up these microservices now, and they're providing APIs. And so the fabric is becoming quite complicated and dynamic to track and manage.
It is. I mean, services-oriented architecture and its loosely coupled nature makes a tremendous amount of sense from a certain point of view. But the fact of the matter is that these highly distributed applications come with complexities of their own. And knowing, various trace routes through these things as they're executing is the only way, perhaps, to really understand how these applications are functioning as they get what I would call more expanded. And I'm being kind. I mean, I almost think of it as sprawl in a way, but I know that some people would take umbrance with that. So.
It's a bigger footprint is how I would like to say. It's a bigger footprint. Now, yeah, so there's a lot more pieces to manage now. It's more ephemeral. It's out of your control. It's in the cloud or in somebody else's hands. So what are do you have any major concerns, or what keeps you up at night with all this going on? I mean, I'm sure a lot keeps you up at night, but what are you really concerned about?
Well, I think, look, I mean, moving to loosely coupled microservices architecture serves a very specific purpose, a couple of them actually. But along with that, we're on this quest for speed, time to deliver, agility. But I worry that in our haste to do that we lose some of what are quite necessary governance control points. And so I think largely about how can we create velocity while maintaining control, and do that in a way that is unobtrusive as possible.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. As you know, I have a long history in enterprise architecture and understanding the structure of things and be able to create future states and be able to get there. I think governance is a big factor as things become more ephemeral and more disconnected, and the bigger footprint is created. Given the nature of our CMDB being shared across all of the products that we have, it's evolving to Service Graph or Digital Enterprise Fabric. So how does it change sort of how you think about the CMDB becoming more real time and attached to those development activities, the things that are happening on the planning and development side?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different points there. One is that, we used to think of the CMDB as the current operating state, right? And a very granular look from infrastructure application point of view. And now it's evolving to represent the full SDLC of modern digital products and services. And so the cornerstone object as you work yourself through that, plan, build, operate, service, it is changing as a dimension in time. In other words, the object that I'm centering on in the ideation and planning phase could be very different than the object I'm focused on in a development stage versus the object I'm focused on in an operate stage. Meaning, I might be running one application service. I might be in ideation of a new service to replace the existing one entirely. And then I might be in the build stage of V2 of the one that I'm ideating to replace. And so how all of these things are interconnected and the representation of their anchor objects over time, because those are actually dimensions in time, varies significantly. And so being able to understand and conceptualize that from a model point of view, and then provide cohesive feedback loops into each of the disciplines that works inside of that overall life cycle structure is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. I know we're doing a lot from a lifecycle management point of view in terms of, coordinating across the portfolio. There's a lot going on there. When it comes to connecting the dots, the thing that I hear more is product centric is really the thinking that most of our customers are wanting to go. So they have that understanding of the ideation, I would say idea to product sort of life cycle, right? And use of that product, right? So you can maintain and manage it over its life cycle.
Sure. I actually think there are multiple levels of that. I mean, certainly the product and product management aspect in and of itself is important. And if I were to go, for example, a step below that and look at, the individual team that is, planning stories and executing in development and producing artifacts, managing config files in support of that product is another area where we're doing a lot of work and bringing visibility to. But then there's a layer above that where I'm a portfolio manager who's responsible for multiple products. I need to understand the demand generation for each of those and allocate my budget across those things to accomplish the strategic goals that my enterprise has set out for me. And so I actually think there are multiple dimensions of that are being represented. And I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's one of the unique things of being here at ServiceNow, because we see this entire, I would say, landscape of factory items to be able to produce these digital products and services that ultimately will be used by our customers' or employees, right? So do you have any, I would say, words of wisdom for our customers in terms of, as we sort of, create this end-to-end data foundation that serves the end-to-end factory or enterprise fabric that I think everybody's trying to go after, right? They want everything to work quickly, efficiently, without mistakes, the handoffs, no more, throw things over the wall. Those days are over. So any sort of highlights on the perspective of us being able to do this better than anybody else, or some of the systems that you might have worked with in the past?
Yeah, I really think that we're in a unique position here because we've evolved over time to go deep into many areas that are common within the enterprise. And within each of those areas are what I would call the gold nuggets. And the gold nuggets need to be shared in a new way because of enterprise digital transformation. Really, it's about a more team-oriented, team-centered approach, but it's not completely divorced from everything else. And so you need to have these feedback loops from centralized functions or quasi-centralized functions into these teams, but also these teams are generating significant data that also needs to be shared and understood from a larger managerial perspective. And because our platform so naturally allows workflow and feedback loops, I think we're in the perfect position to execute on that in a way that few other companies could think about.
Yeah, they couldn't even dream about. Yeah, I agree. And I think, we can refactor things. One of the interesting things about CSDM is we have this common language now that all these products across different dimensions, different jobs are now using and contributing to. And it's really changed, I think, how product teams see the data, or are able to leverage it in new automated ways, analyzing things or being able to automate steps in the process that we couldn't automate before.
Yeah, it's going to make a significant impact. And I honestly believe that it will have a profound impact, not only on how enterprises organize themselves, but on the result of those feedback loops changing the way that software is actually created. And that's the thing that I get excited about. I mean, there's a wide variety of ways that demand is generated for net new feature function, stopgap. There's just a whole lot of things that generate different forms of demand, and being able to visualize all of that as you're thinking about, from an agile perspective, what are my next set of sprints going to work on? What do I need to do? Has somehow my attack surface of my application undergone something that forces me to rethink and change some way that my application is functioning in order to minimize that attack surface? Or what if a majority of my customers think that this new feature would really help them in their day-to-day activity? There's just so many ways that we have to gather feedback now that it really creates what I would call a 360-degree view of everything that needs to be taken into consideration at each point along that SDLC.
Yeah.
And it's almost like it's a whole new world.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to describe it like the first time you ever used an iPhone, for example, right? It's like, I didn't know I needed it until I started using it and got used to it, right? It's smartphones are just changing the paradigm.
I've never used an iPhone, so I can't.
All right, Android then.
I'm an Android guy.
But it's the same thing. But yeah, once you go there, you don't go back. Well, thank you very much, Michael. This has been insightful for me and a pleasure. I hope we can do more of these.
Sure will, Mark, and it's always good to spend time with you.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right.